Hello, everyone. Here I'm going to talk about climate change in estuaries, state of the science and framework for assessment, which is a comprehensive guide resource that we've put together over the last couple of years, addressed at both our managers, the general public, school teachers, even researchers. And I should mention that this is a large collaborative and interdisciplinary effort, really. And you can see the different universities and institutions involved here. So why do we actually compile this? Well, we have a lot of estuaries in New South Wales and a lot of people live around estuaries here in Australia. But we've really, in many cases, gone from a natural system like this to something like that, an already impacted system. And now we have the added impacts from climate change, and we're really at a bit of a crossroads where we can either keep going forward with a business as usual sort of approach, or we can aim to understand these risks and sort of have an adaptive management kind of approach and aim for a sustainable development. But for that, and the New South Wales government now acknowledges this, we need to understand what these climate change risks actually are in estuaries, because we've seen this before in this workshop. We get projections for the ocean or the catchment or the atmosphere, but we don't get any projections at the estuary level. And these are actually really, really complex to assess because of this interactions of forces from the ocean, the catchment, and local human developments. So we said, let's try to simplify that as much as possible. So we came up with this framework where we essentially say you have these broad scale climate drivers that drive physical estuarine processes, which drive the estuary ecosystem. And then you have these human stressors interacting with that. So we came up with this conceptual framework here for assessing climate change impacts, which essentially guides the readers of these documents step by step through this assessment of how we thought it should be done, or it makes sense to be done. Essentially, you start with your global climate models or ensembles thereof. You then go to ideally regional or high resolution climate models. But then you need some form of local estuary model to break this down further. As what you're really interested in is any potential changes in the physical or geophysical environment of the estuary. Think water temperature, salinity, water levels, because these eventually are going to impact the estuary ecosystem. But we also need to consider feedback loops between the ecosystem and the physical environment, such as, for example, accretion of marshes. And we need to factor in these existing stressors. And so based on this conceptual framework, we then developed this guide document, which is really aligned with this conceptual framework, but it's essentially each of these is a standalone kind of document that you can dive into. And so I'm going to show you, just give you a bit of a feel for how these actually look. We're going to jump over to the website here, where this is all hosted. So this is all freely accessible for everyone. And you can see here, we can go to the risk assessment guide, where you're going to see these same frameworks again. And you can then go into the actual documents. So let's say you're just getting started, you want to have a look at or get a feel for this all, for the topic. You can either download the PDF or open it online. And then you're gonna see that we put quite a lot of effort into actually designing them quite nicely, because we wanted them to be used as much as possible by the managers, etc. And again, we really made sure to keep the whole process consistent and simple. Can then have a look at, say, if you're just more interested in the climate change side of things, you would go to module 2, which really gives you a good overview of how are these projections of global climate change actually made, what kind of models are used there, how can you actually drill into these models, extract data, and then break this down to a level that's useful for the estuary or system scale. And one thing that I want to quickly show you here is a summary table that we collated that literally summarize all the relevant climate change impacts for both the average and the extremes. It looks at historic trends in the historic data as well as future projections. And then for each of these, the color coding tells you if it's high confidence, green, moderate, or low confidence, which will be red, because we really need to communicate this better, that we have a much more robust estimation of something like air temperature than we have for rainfall or extreme events, which we really have high levels of uncertainties in these global climate models. And that is something I think we need to get better at communicating. Let's have a look at the ecological module. So again, module 3 would then show you all these modeling techniques that you can use to break the global climate change drivers down to your system scale. Module 4 then looks at the ecosystem, different sort of stressor and response models. So I'm not an ecologist myself. This was written by ecologists. And you can see there's all sorts of cool illustrated ecological models in here. And we also try to give at least a qualitative estimate of how different types of estuaries are going to be impacted by climate change. So here, for example, we're looking at intermittently open and closed systems, different climate drivers, different ecosystem components. How vulnerable are they at a sort of broader scale level? I just also want to show you a few other resources here. So if you're maybe teaching on estuaries, you could have your students go through this section we call like to ask the expert, where there's different questions and then different team members are providing answers. So you even have Peter Skanes, another workshop presenter here, talking about climate change impacts in estuaries. And this is quite a high quality sort of video footage that we have.
So over 80% of the population of New South Wales actually lives in close proximity to estuaries. We have 100.
Unfortunately, we don't have time today to dive into this, but I encourage you all to just check it out. It's easy to spend a few minutes here and check out these resources and maybe hand them over to school students or whoever you think might be interested in this, or the general public. There's also a general introduction video for the whole topic here. But one last thing I wanted to show you is the eco thresholds database. So this is based on a review of over 300 pieces of literature that has investigated the physiological thresholds of different estuarine species to change in their environment. So say what's the upper and lower bound of water temperature that these species can live in. And you can literally look at these studies on this map interface here. Look at, for example, seagrasses, water temperature in this case, and you see the minimum and the maximum range here, right? And the cool thing here is that you can actually upload your own study into this community database. And it would be really cool if we could actually get your feedback on this, because we haven't seen any uptake yet because we haven't advertised it. But I think this could be a useful thing going forward as a central resource on physiological thresholds of estuarine species. But please let us know your thoughts and have a look at it. So with this, I'll conclude my talk for today, and thank you for tuning in.